that she sends out to you. So why are we all here today? First of all, I get the great pleasure of introducing our guest speakers every month. And today we are in for a real treat. There's a big difference between developing a strategy and developing a strategy that an organization can actually execute on. And Larry and I were just talking about that as you guys were joining, the difference between knowledge and understanding. And that gap in strategy and that ability to execute has been a systemic problem for companies to solve for many years. I wrestled with it in my time as an executive at HP, and I know that my peers out there in industry are as well. And so how do we address this? The challenge is really knowing how to select not only what approach you're going to take, but how do you scale that? And then where do we even begin? And so today our speaker partners with C-suites and leaders in organizations to help develop those strategies that improve business performance, to gain that strategic alignment, and ultimately to produce that operational effectiveness that we're all looking for. It requires a deep understanding of how to structure an organization for optimal flow and how to really get the most out of that strategic alignment from top to bottom and bottom to top. And so Larry really focuses his areas of expertise, obviously, on the enterprise, but what we're going to talk about today isn't limited to the enterprise. So I would strap in and get ready, because this is a topic that is hot out there in the industry right now, and Larry is one of the premier experts and thought leaders in this space. So with that, prepare to be blessed, and I would like to welcome my friend, Larry LaSalle.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad that I can actually see you guys. Sometimes I do webinars like this and they have it set up so I don't actually get to see anybody. So it's nice to see a few faces. So good afternoon and good evening to wherever you are. Really excited to join you guys today. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here with the things we're going to cover today. So before I do, though, I just want to touch on a couple of things to sort of piggyback some of the things that Steve was talking about. The story behind Scaled OKRs actually started as a boutique consultancy in 2016 called Agility IQ. And I was in enterprise agile transformation for a number of years. I would tell you that, like, in my bones, I'm an agilist, and I would mean that. What I ran into when I was trying to help enterprise transformation was didn't really have a tool in my bag, if you will, or on my belt that would make it so I could confidently go into a leadership, or call upon a leader and say, hey, there's some things that are going right with our transformation, some things that are going wrong, and here's how we need your help, and here's where we could use your help. And so I never really had, some language or, some topics to bring to leaders. And so in order to kind of unstick their transformations, to get them more involved. And so my pursuit of OKRs, believe it or not, was probably different than most, but might be more like what you guys experience, which is to try to get OKRs to help with the Agile space, because the two really do need to work together hand in hand. And how they work together is super key to understand, and to understand really well. And so my hope for all of you today is that you do understand sort of how OKRs and Agile can work together, but mostly how OKRs really need to be done in such a way that they land right in the organization and that they're received by the right people that are willing and ready to take action in the right way to support OKRs, okay? So we're going to look at 5 things. I don't know how long we'll be able to get away with topics like this, where we look at the 5 things or the 3 things, but we're still in a window where we can look at 5 things. And so we want to look at 5 things that you just absolutely have to understand about OKRs, or I can tell you stories how you may go months and potentially even a couple of years doing OKRs in a way that's not really effective, and you'll be trying to wonder why. And so as we step through some of these things today, any of you that are doing OKRs or have done OKRs and can relate to some of the things we talk about, please raise your hand, share the stories, and help to kind of get the messaging out on some of the things that we really need to get right with OKRs, okay? So we're going to first look at OKRs as a strategy and alignment framework, okay? And then we're going to look at how do we organize OKRs for maximum alignment and focus. And there's a trick to that. Then we're going to talk about leveraging OKRs as a strategy, or how to connect strategy to execution with OKRs. And then we'll talk about operationalizing OKRs with OKR Cycle. And then we'll wrap up with a touch on change management and the importance of change management as it relates to a successful implementation of OKRs, okay? Like Steve said, sort of strap in and get ready. There's a handful of slides we've got to cover here. I'll move through them fairly quickly, but please don't hesitate to ask questions along the way, okay? All right. So the first thing that you probably already know about OKRs is that they've become popularized with this notion of, major success, Google-like success. And there's these pointers to companies like Intel and others, Google for sure, Microsoft's often mentioned as these companies that are, having these just crazy success, and they attribute it to OKRs, okay? Now, so there's the tempting, right? Okay, we can be like Google if we can do OKRs. That notion is built primarily from the book Measure What Matters, which is how many people get introduced to OKRs. The author of Measure What Matters, his name is John Doerr. He learned about OKRs before they were called OKRs like we're calling them today. He learned about them in the 70s from Andy Grove at Intel. And so they had really built the management framework, if you will, around this sort of goal-setting methodology that Andy Grove had at Intel. And then years later, John Doerr then introduced them to Google when Google was like 14 people strong, literally a baby company. And so for them, it was easy to adopt OKRs because they didn't have another framework. Companies that have been in business for 50 or 100 years, it's a very different story because we're not a startup and we can't just decide one day to do OKRs like the book might suggest. There's a lot more to it. But this is how most people get introduced to OKRs nonetheless. In fact, I would say, at least probably half of our clients will mention that they've required reading of Measure What Matters and things of that nature. So definitely a prevalent entryway to OKRs is that book. Now, when people read the book and they get through the anecdotal stories and things of that nature, they generally understand that OKRs is an acronym that stands for objective and key result. And the objective, this is where some of the appeal for OKRs starts to come in, is right from the beginning. The objective is supposed to be this aspirational goal, like some organizations will call it their big bet, right? It's this notion of what are the things that we want to achieve, the big important things. And then the key results are those things that tell us what we can measure to know that we've actually achieved the big thing that we wanted to achieve. And so there's this simplicity to OKRs and there's this appeal to it, right? Like, hey, if we can just set clear objectives with clear key results and do it in a way that's Google-like, maybe we will have Google-like success. And so with that, they say, do OKRs. And I'm not kidding, this is oftentimes how organizations will get started with OKRs. It may not look as dramatic as the picture, but it might be just as simple. Let's start doing OKRs. Now, that is what's going to segue us into the 5 things that you need to know, because this approach to OKRs would be similar to, anything that you try to change in an organization where you just start doing it. What are some of the problems with that? Well, People have different understandings of what it is we're going to do. People have different needs about how they're going to relate it to their work. There's all kinds of factors that need to be considered, such that just doing it and kind of figuring that we'll figure it out as we go because it seems so easy, that's what I would say can be dangerous, because it can put you in a jeopardizing situation. Okay, so let's look at the first thing that you need to know about OKRs. And the first thing is you need to know that OKRs are a strategy and alignment framework. So let me explain what that means exactly. So in the book, Measure What Matters, John Doerr mentions, this right here. John Doerr describes OKRs as a collaborative goal-setting methodology used by teams and individuals to set challenging, ambitious goals with measurable results. And you could read the rest. Now, I'm sharing this with you because that definition right there won't scream strategy and alignment framework to you, right? It doesn't scream it. In fact, it says goal setting. It says what this definition begs for me to tell you what's the difference between OKRs and SMART goals, because it doesn't really, it makes it sound as if it's something that we can do and just have teams do it, right? But once you really dig into OKRs and understand it, you'll find that this definition is actually problematic. This is a much better definition. And I'll read this definition and then compare the two and talk about why this is the first thing you need to know. So let's look at this definition where we say that OKRs are a strategy and alignment framework that seeks to ensure organizational clarity by creating an environment of common goals and shared commitments. Okay, now both of these goals are true. Both of them are true. We do need teams that can organize around goal setting, and we do need to have this notion of challenging and inspiring goals. And this is true as well. But here's what's important to understand. If in fact you want your organization to make the connection of OKRs to strategy as opposed to goal setting, then the word of caution is be careful what definition you use to facilitate the conversation and to drive understanding in your organization. I really encourage that you use this definition here because it will provide you the foundation for telling a better story. Watch, I'll explain. See, OKRs, one of the power with OKRs is not just our ability, just my ability in an organization to set goals and make measurable key results that show that I achieved it. That's part of it, okay? But where OKRs differentiate and where you do see that kind of success that we talked about is where you bring together aligned goals, and you bring together aligned goals that connect to the organizational strategy. So let's look at this slide a little bit because it's important to understand some of the stuff that's on here. On the left, it shows that you have vision, purpose, and strategy, and then OKRs. So thing number one you really got to know is that strategy is an input to OKRs, okay? So as an OKR coach, for example, different from an Agile coach, an OKR coach might learn how to facilitate a SWOT analysis with a group of executives, because we need to be able to get out the strategy that we want to achieve in order for us to then build out the OKRs that say this is how we're going to achieve it. So your strategic roadmap of 1 to 3 years is actually an input to your 2 layers of OKRs. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but I want to start to emphasize 2 levels of OKRs, a strategy level and a tactical or quarterly level. Strategy level is annual, quarterly is the tactical level. So you take your strategy and then you'll have a handful of strategic OKRs that are annual in nature, and they will cascade to a set of quarterly OKRs that are a little bit more tactical in nature. We could spend quite a while talking about just that. But the important thing, one, is that if your strategy isn't informing your OKRs and you're trying to masquerade OKRs as a strategy, then your OKRs will suffer the same fate as the strategy that was missing, which is we will be a dynamic organization where everything's always changing because we don't really have line of sight on where we're trying to go and what we're trying to achieve. So that kind of swirl that always happens is would be inconsistent with an organization that's doing OKRs and doing OKRs well. Okay, so that's thing one. I'm going to keep going until you guys ask questions. We don't have a whole ton of time. So thing two, this one has a little video in it because this is really, really interesting. Okay, so thing two that you need to understand has to do with that cascading that we just talked about. That's the word that's used to describe levels of OKRs that cut across two levels. It's a cascading relationship from a higher level, could be the company level down to, say, line of business level. It could be company level down to department, whatever that is, okay? But now here, this is where things get interesting. Most companies, when they do OKRs, they'll understand, because there's a few other rules to it, like we do set these lofty goals with key results and whatnot. But the trick is that we don't want to set a lot of these goals, right? We don't want to set a lot. We want to have a few. However, what happens is you have this group of people, like let's say this is a typical organization. You have your CEO and several other leaders in the organization reporting directly to the CEO. The mistake that most organizations make is they have each of the individual leaders that are responsible for some aspect of the business. Each of them do 3 to 5 OKRs for the year. And then the next, if they cascade them down appropriately, the rest of the organization will do OKRs at the next level down. However, you have to crunch the numbers on that. If you have, say, 10 leaders at the top, right? If they all do 3 to 5 each, then you could end up with 30 to 50 OKRs that you're offering back to the organization. Now, see, here's the thing is some organizations will do that and they won't see the problem in that. But what they do is they offer 30 to 50 functional OKRs, because each of those OKRs, if these individuals at the top create OKRs within the context of their functional specialty in the organization, then they will ultimately craft OKRs that look like the functional context of that department or group. What we call this is they're binding their OKR strategy to their organizational hierarchy. So the question to all of you is, how many organizational hierarchies have you seen that are optimized for flow? Probably none. So if you bind your goals to a hierarchy in an organization that isn't optimized for flow, it's optimized for functional management, then you'll basically create an environment of intense functional goals that are basically aligned to departments. And it's not helping the organization to see what it is we're trying to achieve as an organization, because everything is broken down into the department level. So how do you fix that? What do you do? What's the option? And this is where we get to watch a video. The interesting thing about this is what I'm offering to you in the video actually predates widespread use of OKRs, because what I'm going to show you in this video came from Patrick Lencioni in his book, The Advantage. Patrick Lencioni also wrote the book, 5 Dysfunctions of Teams. So he's a very well-known like management guru in this space, but he wrote this in like 2010. And he's been trying to send this message for many, many years. And now with OKRs, the connection's like, wow, you really see it. So I'm going to hit play on this, and it's just 2 minutes long, but you'll make the connection and see how important this is.
members of a leadership team have to do. Important thing. One of the most important things that members of a leadership team have to do is understand which team that they're a member of is their top priority. And in my model on organizational health, this falls squarely within the first discipline, which is building a cohesive team. So if you were to ask any leader in an organization, which team was their top priority, the team that they're a member of that runs the organization, or the team that they lead, their department, many of them will admit, because this is very natural and understandable, they'll admit that their top priority is actually the team that they lead, not the one that they're a member of. It kind of looks like this. If this is the leadership team, and each member of this team has their own department that they run, it is very natural for this person here to put this team at a higher priority than the leadership team or the executive team. And as natural and understandable as that is, it's very dangerous in an organization. Because when this happens, when every member of this team is prioritizing the team they lead over the team they're a member of, the executive team then becomes like the United Nations or Congress, where everybody is getting together to lobby for their constituents, rather than to come together to make decisions that are for the good of the whole organization. Now, when I confront leaders about this, one of their first objections is, well, how is that going to make these people feel when they find out that they are no longer my top priority? Now, here's the funny thing about that. Do you know who wants this to be the number one team more than anybody? It's the people that work in this department and this department and this department and every other department that reports into these leaders. Because when this team is not working together, when these people have not made this group their top priority, these people are left to fight bloody and unwinnable battles with one another. Because if these people haven't resolved their differences and left their meetings with clear marching orders for their departments, they cannot possibly succeed. So really, why do these people make this their top priority? Because you know something? They spend more time with these people usually. They've hired those people. They like being the leader of that team. This might be their functional area of expertise. But they have to overcome that and realize that until they can come into this room, leave their departments behind, and become executives for this company and this team, they will never create a healthy organization.
All right. All right, so you can see the difference there, that if you have a leadership team, we're looking at the same org hierarchy before the video, right? But you need to get that upper level right. This is the second thing you must know about OKRs, right? If you don't get this group up here to come together to create those 3 to 5 strategic OKRs that guide the organization, then you're going to flood the organization with department level functional goals that doesn't ratchet up focus, doesn't ratchet up the opportunity for cross-department collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. So what you're really getting introduced to right now is this notion of shared OKRs. That's really what we're talking about. Because if you guys all as Agilists know that this notion, it's super big in the Scaled Agile framework. In fact, it's one of their core aspects of the framework, which is you have to extract out the value streams and align people around the value that they deliver. Because if you leave them in their organization, then you have to manage the dependencies and the communication across them. And we know what that looks like. It's not good, right? So we don't want to inherit that same sort of inefficiency by just getting our OKRs wrong right off the bat. This, I would tell you guys, I've run into this with companies doing OKRs, and they come to me and they're like, it just doesn't work for us. We're trying everything. And you start to explain this to them and they're like, ah, I get it now. So that's one of the big things you need to know. We're going to just cover 2 more quick views on this topic to really reinforce the cascading, and then we'll move on to the connecting strategy to execution. We talked about cascading being the relationship across multiple levels of the organization. Now, some organizations will want to try to go down every level of the organization, from the C-suite all the way down to teams, sometimes even individuals. You can do that there's, this is not consulting time. We'll talk about whether or not it makes sense to do that another time. But the point is that you want to have at least a couple of levels, because it's the creation of the quote unquote goals or the OKRs at those two levels that invite the opportunity to have discussion vertically and horizontally. So vertical and horizontal alignment would be buzzwords for OKRs, okay? Whatever you can think of buzzwords for Agile that are out there, buzzword equivalent in OKRs is vertical and horizontal alignment, where horizontal alignment is actually seen as more critical, because that's where we close the gaps that exist between teams and departments that are otherwise should be working together, right? But vertical alignment is also critical. How often do we, find ourselves having to relay a message that's coming from above, and like we're just casting the message because we don't really have the details why, we're just relaying the message. That's not what we're trying to do with OKRs. So these arrows represent this what you're looking at here would be like a call out view of what like an OKR's picture might look like of how they would be in the organization. You'd have those 3 to 5 strategic OKRs at the top, so that top one would be spread out, and each of them would line up to a handful of tactical OKRs, and the conversation between them is what establishes that alignment. Okay, so let's compare that to other common ways that cascading is done wrong. 2 very common ways that it's gotten wrong. On the left over here is what happens when we say go do OKRs. What happens is all of these, see, we've used the language has switched now. Over here we're talking strategic and tactical. Now, because we're doing it wrong, we're talking departments again. So we're bound back to the organizational hierarchy in these examples. So in this example, these red arrows represent teams that are going in different directions, and they're all doing OKRs, but because they don't understand the need for horizontal alignment, they don't know what the other teams are doing. They don't know how the other teams track their goals. They don't know like how often the other teams meet to discuss their goals, et cetera, right? It's a completely ad hoc approach to OKRs that are not even tied together. So there's no business benefit really to what's happening on the left. On the right is a more common prescriptive method where we'll say, like it'll happen when we create the OKRs like we talked about, where each of the department heads creates functional OKRs. It leads to the notion of assigning OKRs down to the next level. More specifically, what they'll do is they'll say the key results become the objective of the next level down. I hope you can kind of get an image in your mind of what that looks like. But you can see here where we're saying this key result is this department's objective. So it's almost like this department received an initiative versus this here where we're sort of trying to understand what it is we're trying to achieve. And then here becomes all the ways we're trying to achieve it. Very similar to the notion, and this I do think is touched on pretty well in Measure What Matters, but you got to sort of read it carefully, right? Because they do talk a lot in Measure What Matters about bottoms up OKR creation, and it sort of gives this notion that you want to have autonomy when creating those OKRs. And that's true, but it's in the presence of the higher level objectives, if that makes sense. So in other words, each level has the autonomy to do their OKRs, but they all have context. Even if you're doing OKRs at the top of the house, the context you receive is your strategy. So OKRs are never written independent of context when you're doing it right. The context is either the next level up or it's the strategy. Okay. All right. Next thing you need to know, this one is like really, really critical. And before I start clicking through this, I just want to tell you what causes this issue that you're about to learn about is, I would say, the traditional annual planning that most organizations go through, which, when most organizations go through traditional annual planning, they produce lots of initiatives or projects, and they fund projects. So in organizations that are not touching their traditional annual planning, and they're still producing lots of projects or initiatives every year, individuals that are doing OKRs in that environment end up creating OKRs to support projects or initiatives that were defined as part of annual planning. And the OKRs they create end up looking like mini project plans, because they're not a business goal. They're an objective to achieve a defined project or a defined initiative. And so what's happening is we've got the sequencing wrong. What I mean by that is we're defining projects before we define our business goals or our objectives and our key results. So you have to get the sequencing right. And if you get the sequencing right, then you can see the magic. So let's look at what happens when you sequence it right, such that we create our goals first and then decide what it is we're going to build or what we're going to do. Okay, so here's the first one. So let's say, for example, what's now outlined in the checkered box there is a company level objective. It says increase recurring revenues, and we're going to follow just one of the key results. Okay, we're going to follow the reach monthly recurring revenue of $250,000. So that's the objective and a key result. That's a strategic level. It's at the top, right? So now the next level down, these would be your people that are responsible for the solutions and the systems that deliver the capabilities of the organization, right? That's not the executives typically in the organization. They typically define the vision and the strategy, and then they have people that are responsible for product and they're experts in their space. And that next level down, where they're closer to the customer problem, understanding the opportunity, understanding the organization's capability, they then have to say, how can we achieve this higher level goal? And they have their discussion and they talk about it. And in this example, they might say, well, one thing we've been wanting to do is expand into the Southeast region. Okay, so they define an objective for that. So the strategic objective is, the annual objective is increase recurring revenues with a recurring monthly revenue KR. And then the next level down, it's expand into the Southeast region. So you can see the relationship though, because market expansion generally means customer expansion, which hopefully means revenue. So they set some key results for that next level down. So this is now a quarterly tactical objective. And the key result is obtain 1,000 new customers. That's their goal over the coming quarter. So these, by the way, the LOB stands for line of business. So this is sort of mimicking a company and then line of business level KRs or OKRs. But now that we know what we want to achieve, it's time for us to say, what can we actually produce and build and develop to achieve the goal? Now we've got the sequence right, because we've set the business goal, and now we can say, however we want to achieve this, what is it we can do to achieve this? And in this example, we're saying that they're going to do a couple of different epics or project that doesn't, the language isn't really important. If you're an organization that does epics, then use epic language here, otherwise projects. But the point is you define this project now this work, we would know that this work is aligned directly to a strategic company goal. Most OKR platforms out there now, some anyway, will have this capability where you can, if you can imagine a tree view, you can expand your objective and then expand the key result. And beneath the key result, you start to see the work that we're doing to deliver those objectives. That's the right sequencing there, at least in practice. And so what this allows us to do now is, now you're in the agile space over here on the right side now, right? Now we're all agile over here. We're going to build this work and we're going to have a leading indicator, right? So we've got this leading indicator about how much we think we're going to achieve with this work we're going to do, and then we build it. And then we can use that lean startup type of principles to evaluate what it is we actually achieved. And then we can do the agile practices that we want, which is shut down work that's not adding value and accelerate work and continue doing work that is adding value. That's one of the core outcomes we want to achieve with good agile and good product management practices. And so by connecting these, you can see this example up here. We set out to get 250 new customers and we only got 25, so we stopped that work. Versus down here, we did an Apple bundle. We thought we were going to do 750 new customers and we got 900. So this is the right work. But this is what we refer to as the literal connection of strategy to execution. Now, there's a lot of nuance here because I wouldn't want to infer that all work in an organization must line up to a OKR, because there's a lot of run the business type of work that we do that doesn't necessarily need to have an OKR unless it's something we're trying to fix and improve. Okay, so this is that connection, but you can see how if we get the sequence wrong, we lose a feedback loop back to strategy, because the feedback loop here, when we are evaluating the real outcomes of the work we delivered, is how much did it move the needle on our quarterly KR, which then we can ask how much did it move the needle on our strategic KR. So we're no longer trying to have like a feedback loop back to within an individual project. It's a feedback loop all the way to strategy. And it's a really important piece to understand. So sequencing of goals and initiatives from things you need to know about OKRs is really, really important. Because if when you are writing OKRs that are project centric, it's really constraining. It's already difficult to write OKRs, guys. That could be an exercise for another webinar in the future, perhaps. But when you're constrained to the boundaries of a project or initiative and you're trying to write them, it's really hard to express real business outcomes. Y'all with me? All right. Fourth thing we need to know is, how do we operationalize OKRs? One of the things with OKRs that you would say is like the Achilles heel is what we call set it and forget it with OKRs, right? Where they set the goals, and then what happens is if we don't understand the notion of creating OKRs that are strategically aligned to help inform work choices of what we're actually going to work on, if we don't know that we need to do that, then we won't understand that we really are trying to establish an entire operating rhythm around that, right? And so the OKR cycle, some people will do OKRs and not understand that there's a cycle behind OKRs. And so since you all are agilists, I will describe it to you like this, okay? In a sense, okay, I'll caveat this a little bit, but think of the OKR cycle as sort of a macro cycle for the company as a whole, or maybe a line of business or a portfolio or something. But it's a macro sprint, if you will, for that whole group, right? So it becomes the quarterly cadence, within which we have micro sprints, which would be the 2-week sprints that we would be executing, right? So with OKRs, we're trying to get a rhythm that is happening on a quarterly basis that gives that feedback loop to strategy. So let's look at the OKR cycle and understand what is that repeating pattern that we're trying to establish. The first thing is that strategic context, right? That's an input to the OKR cycle. We get strategic context. The next part is that we co-create, there's 2 buzzwords here, co-create and localize. Co-create means we create our OKRs with other departments and other teams. Localize means we create our OKRs as a team too, right? So both are true. We're going to, in other words, no lone soldiers creating OKRs on behalf of teams. That's not the way we want to do it. Much of the same way, if you've ever, had the good fortune of doing a good, successful, agile rollout, and you start to see how you unlock those creative thinking by getting people participating in the ideation and the engineering aspect of things where we're coming up with solutions. When people are able to participate and contribute, they put skin in the game and they feel a part of themselves sort of in the work they're doing. That's the kind of things we're trying to do with OKRs, right? That's why we're talking about OKRs within the context of driving purpose into the organization, right? Helping people to feel like they can relate to what it is that we're trying to actually accomplish as an organization by creating a purpose-driven environment, okay? So that's co-create and localize. And then you have to develop action plans. Action plans is when we start to decide what it is we're actually going to produce to achieve our goals. What is it we're going to build? And what all the things are that we need to do to achieve it, including organizing ourselves. That's part of action planning. And then the frequent check-ins. And so this means we're going to check in on our OKRs periodically, and we're going to do confidence votes, and we're going to, do some scoring to indicate how we feel we are doing with our OKRs. Are we feeling good about them, or are we not? Because we want to be able to manage to the reality of what our teams and our people are experiencing with their OKRs. Because if we're doing OKRs right, OKRs represent the goal, what it is we're trying to achieve. And so if we're off track with our OKRs, we're off track with everything, right? So we want to check in and we want to know how we're doing. And then finally, remember the macro sprint idea, right? The quarterly sprint, just like a regular sprint. When you come out of the sprint, you're talking about what did we just achieve? What did we just learn? What do we need to do differently? Similarly, right? That's why Agile is a system of learning, right? When you really cut to it and get into it, really what it's trying to do. OKRs as well, similar, right? A system of learning. What are we learning about? We're learning about how our ideas and our efforts are landing with our customers. But more importantly, we're learning about how do we ourselves in our organization get in our own way and prevent ourselves from being able to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve. In other words, there's internal factors and external factors that we always need to be figuring out. How do we improve and get better? And if we are doing OKRs with that in mind, in other words, what is our ability as an organization to organize and execute on a quarterly rhythm? Can we do it? That's what you need to be able to do with OKRs, because there is a cycle that you come out of it each quarter to learn and adapt, and then you start again. So just like if you were a team that's learning Scrum, you learn this new thing called a sprint, and then next thing you know, you're on sprint 1 and sprint 2 and sprint 3, and then you almost just stop counting because we're just into sprints forever, right? Same thing with OKR cycles. We just want to think of it as this persistent, ongoing, forever way of working. Now, overlay that with the ad hoc ways in which most organizations run today. Think about it like this. Most organizations don't even have a notion of, say, starting all projects at the same time so that we can have a consistent learning loop and learn as an entire organization. Instead, they all start and stop at all different points in time, and they all sort of learn within the micro, project context, and we're never able to improve as an organization overall. So we're looking for rhythm, we're looking for cadence, and we're looking for consistency. And that is where really you'll hear this notion of rigor and discipline also offered with OKRs, because it does take that, right? It does take that consistency and our ability to establish that new rhythm for it to work. Okay. All right. This is just a slightly different view of the OKR cycle. So if you were doing your first OKR cycle ever, okay, you know, you're going to have some runway for things you need to do out here to get ready. But then once you start your OKR cycle, that's that 3-month window that we're going to do again and again. And it's within that 3-month window that you want to have those touch points, right? Now, if you've already, or if you're in an organization that already has processes in place and already has all that, integrate OKRs into those processes, okay? And then have a mid-cycle review or whatever works. Some companies will do, you know, each month, they'll do monthly reviews to reflect on how they're doing. How are we progressing? So any of you that might be closely working with scaled agile framework, and you're into that PI planning rhythm, you'll have that same idea, that same notion. The only difference now with OKRs is OKRs are simply an input to the PI planning. They're sort of setting the vision. I realize we're running out of time, guys, so I'm going to just quickly go through the last thing here, which is to say, you have to follow good change management practices when we're working with OKRs. That ad hoc approach of go do OKRs will get you ad hoc results, okay? So you look at things like scaled agile framework again. Change management at scale requires good change management practices. So within this scaled agile framework, you've got that lean agile center of excellence, or a LACE. That type of a construct would serve well in OKRs as well, meaning it's a group of people that are the champions to help enable the organization to adopt this new way of working. Because guess what? Most people don't give a hoot about OKRs. You all are a small group of people. You know, most people just want to go and do their jobs, right? So this is definitely what I refer to for folks as new muscle memory. And so that takes time and patience, and you have to enable the organization to achieve it. So you can look to John Cotter as a way. He's got his 8 steps, you know, that are well formulated. It's really the foundation for SAFE's implementation roadmap. There's a pointer. What I want to get to you guys, and I'll work with Sherry after this, if you guys are interested, is I'm going to get you guys an implementation canvas, and I'll show you that in just a second. But because OKRs have been around for a while, we've got this evolving set of universal implementation parameters. These came from the OKR field book, which was published last year. Can't go into all of these right here, but if you do go through each of these when you're planning an OKR implementation, you'll be many steps ahead of organizations that don't put careful thought into the different important considerations when it comes to adopting change like this, okay? And this is the canvas here. I'm sorry I can't go through all 10 of those parameters, but this is a canvas that we can send to you as a takeaway that will help you understand sort of how do we put our ideas for how we want to use OKRs onto paper so that we can ensure that we're thinking about all things. Like, how do we ensure vertical and horizontal alignment, things of that nature, right? So you want to be thoughtful on that. And then I'm just going to leave with this thought here, which is that this sort of summarizes it. When you're doing OKRs, you want to think about how are we going to design our implementation plan, right? The reason we're called scaled OKRs is because we realize that you sort of start with change in one part of an organization, and then you scale that goodness to the rest of the organization once you find what works in that organization, right? So that takes a step of design. And then you have to go through the process of implementation. And then you have to go through the process of developing that muscle memory and getting good. And that's the coaching. Okay. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you found those 5 things to be beneficial for you. They will definitely help ensure that your OKR implementations are much more successful. And I'm going to hang out for questions if you guys have questions, and I can toss it back to Sherry and Steve.
Awesome. Thanks, Larry. That was great. So questions?
I'll take us off sharing here.
Thank you, sir. We were capturing some of them in chat and answering them as we go, but any outstanding questions from chat or live that anyone has for Larry? Feel free to come off mute and jump right in. Or you can raise your hand and it'll pop you to the top of the list.
All right, I'm going
Go
to
for
ask, at what juncture does the organization have that meeting with the top line leaders to define the 3 to 4 OKRs? And can or should this be done as part of strategic planning?
Yes, you should do it as part of strategic planning, especially if you're working with that top of the, the C-suite, if you will, or whoever is responsible. I usually say if they own a P&L, then they should be responsible for the strategy. So if you can get to that level, do OKRs in conjunction with that. And then here's the thing is, you just get into the rhythm, right? You just have to, at some point, you have to say, we're going to do it. What are all of the things we need to get started? I wouldn't say that it makes sense to wait until the January timeframe or December to start on the first of the year, things of that nature, because you want to get out in front of any of the existing processes that are just going to pick up sort of naturally, right? Like if you guys do traditional annual planning, we have to plan that, hey, we can't do it like we've done it all the other years if in fact we want OKRs to sort of reflect strategy and inform the work we're going to do.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you. Has anybody experienced any of the 5 things we covered, by the way? I'm just curious. Lisa's willing to share a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, I figured I'd come off of mute. So at the MBA, what I noticed is that there are let's say 4 top OKRs that are shared at the top of the organization. And what I do see are a lot of the functional departments tie theirs into those 4.
Yeah.
And, obviously there's a few variations, but it's very interesting to see what you shared today is some version of what's happening here, which is good.
Good.
What do you have to say about the crash of oh
Blank.
God, I'm having a brain. Where John Doerr came from, the software, right?
Intel.
It just Intel. Sorry, it's just
Intel.
I mean, didn't that just why did that happen? They were the big OKR, right?
Well, no, so Andy Grove, so here's the real quick story on that. So Andy Grove, so the predecessor to OKRs is management by objectives, MBO, right. MBOs. All Andy Grove did was modify MBOs, and instead of making them sort of something that a manager sets with their employees, he just sort of made the framework something that the whole organization so he in fact was one of the ones that included OKRs with strategic planning and talks about that, in fact.
Right, but they were the poster child. Didn't they just crash? They didn't have some good results recently, right?
Oh,
that's what I'm
recently,
asking.
But the thing to know about them is they started using OKRs in the early 70s, like 70, 71 or something like that. So even if they were having a problem, I mean, they're in a very dynamic space there with microchips, right? So I wouldn't imagine that they're going to be bulletproof forever. So they have to deal with all kinds of geopolitical craziness.
All right, I was just curious, if you had any thoughts on that. That's all.
That industry is wildly cyclic anyway. So Yeah, but
Good
Larry,
point.
I've experienced this. I've experienced the same thing where people, organizations, and it might be the worst anti-pattern out there, confusing MBOs and OKRs. They say they're doing OKRs, but they're really doing MBOs.
Yeah.
My manager asked me for my OKRs to roll up to their OKRs, but it's the worst. It's painful and ugly and terrible and worthless. I just,
And Jeff, I think that was what I was going to add. It's kind of that balance, right? If you have a culture that pushes personal responsibility for personal goals that somehow align with someone else's, that's where, as agilists, we have an opportunity to go, yes, we're talking about accountability and commitment and all of those great things, but that also doesn't mean we're bad at business. And we need to be aligned.
That's it. Good one, Lane. Yep.
Here's the thing, what's worth knowing, all of you, and if you need to drop, you are welcome to drop, but I will tell you that OKRs are going to bump up against the same legacy organizational constructs that Agile did. And Agile has, and Agile does, I should say, because they're so hardened in our organizations. They're like the equivalent of calluses, right? Some of this stuff is so hardened in the organization that people can't think of new ways of doing it. And that's the plight. That's what we're up against as Agilists, of trying to help people just possibly envisioning doing it in a different way. So
I'm going to raise this question, Larry, again. So even bringing up the term MBOs, because I think, I think there's some of that still lives, right? Even Jeff's comment. So, how do you start distinguishing MBOs versus OKRs? Because some may really interpret it as almost one and the same, I think.
You definitely, as there's a number of conversations I have on a regular basis. Strategy versus OKRs, OKRs versus KPIs, OKRs versus MBOs, et cetera, et cetera. The one on the MBOs, though, to say is that MBOs are definitely much more for personal accountability. That's what they were built upon, was personal accountability. I would have my objectives for the year, for example, that my manager gave me. So it was just a different construct, whereas OKRs are meant to be organizational in nature with the focus on business outcomes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, not department goals. So
yeah, and I don't think necessarily MBOs and OKRs are mutually exclusive. To your point, I mean, the business can have OKRs, but I can still have personal objectives, for myself, for my department, for whatever, that I can agree with my manager. I mean, those aren't, they should not conflict, but I'm not sure they're necessarily exclusive either.
No, and they wouldn't be. Where I start to try to, it depends on what the organization has been doing for a long time. Like if MBOs have been there for a while and they mean a certain thing and they've sort of become a cultural element, then it might take a little bit more undoing to help them understand the difference between OKRs. But they can live together cohesively, those two.
And the exciting thing about all of this is that this is not a one-shot deal. So thankfully, Larry was gracious enough to come and talk to us for an hour and give us an introduction to OKRs. But as Sherry said at the beginning, we're going to have lots of activity going on around OKRs moving forward with classes and workshops and blog posts. So definitely stay tuned and stay plugged in if you really want to learn how to implement OKRs in your organization. You absolutely have to go through the training and then even the coaching beyond that. Like anything else, right? Training is interesting. Coaching makes it sticky, but this is a great start and a great introduction.